Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Ayin Beis contains two mishnayos and two general sugyas. The beginning of the daf is discussing a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim as to whether you need a Erev Chatzeres if you already have a sheet of Mavos, and the Gemara will have a machlokes Amarayim what type of Erev Chatzeres and sheet of Mavos we're referring to, and the Gemara will give a psak. Then the Mishnah discusses it begins the sugya of what happens when you have multiple groups living together in one house. Do they count as separate rishuyos? Do they count as one rishus? The first Mishnah discusses where you have physical dividers between the groups. The machlokes there, and there are four opinions in the Gemara as to what type of physical dividers we're referring to. Then the next Mishnah near the end of the daf discusses a family where you have different groups of brothers. What happens there? So first of all, let's begin. So we had seen a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. When you have a sheet of Mavos, do you need to have an Erev Chatzeres as well? That means you have a situation in which there are multiple homes in one Chatzer, and there are multiple Chatzeros. There are multiple such Chatzeros using one Mavoi. If you made a sheet of Mavos, do you also need to have an Erev Chatzeres? According to Rabbi Meir, yes, you do. Otherwise, people will forget all about Shitufei Mavos and Erev Chatzeres. So only do Shitufei Mavos, not Erev Chatzeres. According to the Chachamim, no, it's enough. You either do Shituf Mavos and that counts for everything, or you can do Erev Chatzeres, and then you don't have to worry about Shituf Mavos unless you happen to want to carry in the Mavoi as well. Now, the same Mishnah had also quoted the halacha as to what type of material you use to set up a sheet of mavos and an erev chatzeres. And it said the following thing. It said that bread is the best thing. Where you put your bread is where you establish your residence, and therefore you can use that to make a sheet of mavos or to make an erev chatzeres. However, bread is the only thing you could use to make an erev chatzeres. You can't use wine to make an erev chatzeres. An erev chatzeres has to be something that sets up residence, and wine doesn't do that. Wine could be used for a sheet of mavos. That means sheet of mavos I could use bread or wine. Erev Chatzeres I can only use bread. Now the machlokes Amarayim is in which cases there are machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim as to whether or not you need to have an Erev Chatzeres if I already have a sheet of Mavos. According to the first opinion, and the Gemara says the two opinions are Rav Nechumi and Rabbo. We don't know which one is which, but the first opinion says that they all agree that you don't have to have a Erev Chatzeres if you have a sheet of Mavos that works as an Erev Chatzeres, and that would be a sheet of Mavos that was made with bread, because bread also works for an Erev Chatzeres. The machlokes is if you have a sheet of Mavos that's done with wine which doesn't work for an Erev Chatzeres. That's where they're arguing. According to the Chachamim, it's fine as long as the sheet of Mavos works. It counts as an Erev Chatzeres, even if the material that was used doesn't work for an Erev Chatzeres. According to Rabbi Meir, no, it has to be the type of material that works for an Erev Chatzeres, and therefore it has to be bread. If it'll be bread, I'll agree. But if it's wine, I won't agree. However, the concept of using a sheet of Mavos on principle for an Erev Chatzeres, that nobody has a problem with. And the second opinion is no, that's what the machlokes is. The machlokes is on that concept. So the machlokes is in the case where they use bread, and there's no other problems. The machlokes is the concept of the idea of using a sheet of mavos instead of an erev chatzeres. That's my problem. That's where Rabbi Meir has a problem, and the chachamim say it's not a problem. If you want to use wine though, which doesn't even work for an erev chatzeres, there everybody will agree that that will not help, because you have an additional problem besides for the fact that you're using a sheet of mavos in place of an erev chatzeres. Now the Gemara tries to bring a raya that this explanation of the machlokes doesn't make sense, because if we look at the language of the Chachamim, they said you could either do a sheet of mavos or an erev chatzeres. That sounds like they're telling you do a sheet of mavos the way you do sheet of mavos, do an erev chatzeres the way you do erev chatzeres, and it works one for the other. That would seem to indicate that the sheet of mavos that I'm doing, which I want to work for an erev chatzeres, is done the way I do all shitufei mavos, which is with wine, and that's the case where there's a machlokes. So how could this opinion say that in that case nobody would agree to it? The Gemara says no, that's not what it means. It just means that you will do a sheet of mavos with bread or an erev chatzeres with bread. We're not talking about where you're doing it with wine in the way that you usually do a sheet of mavos. Okay, now the Gemara brings down what is the actual halacha ma'is over here. So Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav, the halacha is like Rabbi Meir. Rav Huna says the minig is like Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Yochanan says the custom of people is like Rabbi Meir. What's the difference between these three expressions? So it's as follows. When we say the halacha is a certain way, that means we can announce that in the shir to the general public. When we say the minig is that way, we can't announce it in the shir, but if somebody comes to ask, that's how we'll answer him. And we say that the people were noihig that way, that means we don't even paskin that way if somebody comes to ask. But if somebody did it already, we don't tell him he has to undo it. He's allowed to rely on that concept. Now we begin the next Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses what happens when you have 5 groups of people that are spending Shabbos in one large building. Now, everybody agrees in this Mishnah that if they're in separate rooms, completely separate rooms or separate floors, that they are separate residences, and if they share a chatzer, you have to make an Erev Chatzeris, and you also have to make an Erev Chatzeris to be able to use internal areas inside the building. And if they want to be represented to another Erev, then you have to either make an Erev Chatzeris to represent all of them, or they have to separately join another Erev. The Machlokes is what happens when it's really one big room and there are just partitions put up between the groups. So according to Beis Shammai, they are still considered to be separate groups, and according to Beis Hillel, they're considered to be one group because they live in one building, and the partitions don't count to divide them into separate reshuyos. They can join as one in another Erev Chatzeris, and they don't need an Erev Chatzeris for them to be able themselves to share the yard in which they share and the common spaces inside the building. Now, the Machlokes Amoraim is what size partitions are we talking about here? And there are 4 opinions brought. There's 2 versions of Rav Nachman's opinion. And then there are another 2 opinions. One is Rabbi Chia, one is Rabbi Shimon, but Rebbe, we don't know which one's which. There are 4 types of walls, which we're going to discuss. Unfortunately, it doesn't break down as to one wall per opinion. It's not quite as simple as that. So the 4 levels of walls that we'll be discussing are as follows. Mesipas. Mesipas is a wooden wall less than 10 tefachim tall. Greater than that is a wall that's 10 tefachim tall. Then we talk about a wall that doesn't reach the ceiling. That could be a 10 tefachim tall wall, or it could be higher. We're going to assume it's referring to a 10 tefachim tall wall, and therefore it's the same as a 10 tefachim tall wall. There will be different opinions about it, though. And then the highest wall is a wall where it's actually a partition that reaches the ceiling. And that doesn't mean it's a completely separate room. It's a temporary partition, but it reaches all the way until the ceiling. Now, what are the 3 opinions over here? So the first opinion in Rav Nachman says that the machlokes is in the case of mesipas, less than 10 tefachim high. If, however, you have any mechitza greater than that, then there's no machlokes. Everybody agrees that they're divided into separate groups. Rav Nachman's second version, the second version of what Rav Nachman said, is that the machlokes is in both mesipas and a 10 tefachim high wall. If the walls go all the way up to the ceiling, then this version of Rav Nachman, we assume logically this version holds that they are separate groups, but the machlokes here is in both cases, mesipas and a 10 tefach high wall. What happens if it's now, as far as the other 2 Amoraim, we don't know which one is which. One of them is very similar to this second opinion of Rav Nachman. He says that the machlokes is when the wall doesn't reach the ceiling. Logically, that would seem to be the same as a 10 tefach high wall. He also would say that if the wall reaches the ceiling, there's no machlokes. Everybody agrees that it's a separation and they are divided up. The only thing is we don't know what he holds in a case of mesipas. We don't know what he holds in the case of mesipas. According to Rav Nachman's second version, there was clearly a machlokes in the case of mesipas. This opinion, we don't know if there's a machlokes there or if everybody agrees that that's not a valid division. Now, the fourth and final opinion says that the only machlokes is in the case of partitions which reach the ceiling. If they don't reach the ceiling, everybody agrees that they are not divided up. They're considered to be one group. The whole machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is when it goes all the way up until the ceiling itself. Now the Gemara is going to introduce a brisa. The brisa has a couple of phrases. We're going to have to see how each of them fit with each of these opinions and how everybody's opinion will explain the steps of the brisa, and then we'll get to a whole other explanation of the machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Okay, this brisa runs as follows. It quotes Rabbi Yehuda Hasabor. Rashi says he was called Hasabor because he was very sharp, and he says clearly, like the last opinion, he says that the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is in a situation where you have walls that do not reach the ceiling. If you have walls that reach the ceiling, there's no machlokes. Everybody agrees that they're separate. If you have walls that don't reach the ceiling, that's where there is a machlokes. So now, the Gemara says, let's see what we can do with each of the 4 opinions. The opinion that said that the machlokes is in the case where the walls don't reach the ceiling, this is a straight up support. This is exactly what he said. The opinion that said that the machlokes is when the walls reach the ceiling, this is clearly not going to fit. It's a tiyufta, because it clearly says here, this brisa, that in that case there is no machlokes, but it still agrees that they're separate. As far as the opinion that says that the machlokes is only about misipas, there's no machlokes about walls that are higher than misipas, there are definitely a separation. That's also knocked off, because here it clearly says that there is a machlokes when you have walls that don't reach the ceiling, which is higher than misipas. The only question we're left with is, what about the opinion that says that there's a machlokes both in misipas and in walls that don't reach the ceiling? This brisa says that there is a machlokes when there's walls that don't reach the ceiling. It does not say what is the story when there's misipas walls that aren't 10 tefachim high. Should we assume that since it defines the machlokes as when there are walls that don't reach the ceiling, that when there are walls that are less than 10 tefachim, there is no machlokes and everybody agrees it's not a separation? Or not necessarily? So the Gemara originally wants to say that you would seem to be an indication that it's that there is no machlokes in the case where the walls are only less than 10 tefachim high. The only machlokes is where you have significant real walls that don't reach the ceiling. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. This opinion could tell you that really there's a machlokes in both cases. The reason why the Mishnah discussed the higher cases to tell you that even there, Beis Hillel still argues, and Beis Hillel still says, even though you have such tall walls, Beis Hillel says they still count as one unified rishus. So the Gemara says, well, why don't you tell me the opposite case? Tell me the case of Masipas and say that even there, Beis Shammai says that they are considered to be separate rishuyos. So Gemara says, because Beis Hillel is saying a heter. Beis Hillel is saying that they're considered to be one and you don't have to do an Erev Chatzeres. Whenever we could tell you the more extreme position, we want to show you the more extreme matir, because that's a bigger chiddush. That somebody says that another thing is aser, that's not a chiddush. Okay, so now the Gemara says, what is the halacha l'maisa? Rav Nachman quotes Rav, who says that the halacha is like this brisa of Rabbi Yehuda Sabar. That's the halacha, so, which means that the only machlokes is in the case of walls which do not reach the ceiling, and we don't know what the story is by Mesipas. Says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. If you look carefully in our Mishnah, you would seem to see that indication as well. Why? The end of the Mishnah says that there's no machlokes if they're in separate walls. There's no machlokes if they're in separate rooms. What do you mean if they're in separate rooms? You think they're really in seriously separate rooms? Then of course there's no machlokes. What's the chiddush? They're in separate rooms. How could you? It's like they're in separate houses. How could you have a havamina? How could you even dream that they would be combined into one rishus already? So it must mean that you have partitions like separate rooms. That means you have partitions that go all the way up to the ceiling. That's a case where there's no machlokes. That means that there is a machlokes, and anything less than that, any partitions that don't reach the ceiling, and that is very much exactly what Rabbi Yehuda Sabar said that this machlokes is about, and the Gemara accepts that. Okay, the Gemara now brings the brisa, which has a totally different understanding of what this machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is. As a matter of fact, this brisa itself has two versions to it, two different gerses, so we have two more versions of what this machlokes is. The Gemara is going to bring a third Tana and want to see who it fits with. According to the first girsa, it'll fit with Beis Hillel. According to the second girsa, it will not fit with anybody, not Beis Hillel, not Beis Shammai. Now, what's the machlokes about according to this version? According to this version, there's no discussion as to wall sizes, whether they're separate groups or not separate groups. We're talking about a situation where everybody agrees that these 5 groups are considered to be joined together. The walls are not significant. They're considered to be 5 groups that are joined. It's as if they have an Erev. So it's as if we're discussing here where you have 5 groups that made an Erev Chatzeres between them. The question is, what happens if the group of 5 wants to join with another group? So here, the halacha depends on where the Erev is being made. If these 5 made an Erev, or these 5 already joined it together, like in our case, and they're going to create an Erev somewhere else and put it in a different place, so then, according to the first girsa of the brisa, there you have a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel says one group just has to bring the Erev for all of them. It's a shliach on behalf of the entire group, the entire Erev 5 groups. They are all joined in an Erev, or in our case, they're joined in one structure, and therefore just one person has to bring that Erev somewhere else. According to Beis Shammai, no, you can't have one of the 5 groups acting as a shliach for the rest of them. Just like you can't have one of 5 houses joined in Erev acting as a shliach for the rest of them. They each have to go separately and bring in Erev to the place that the Erev will be set up. However, according to this version of the Brisa at least, everybody agrees that if the Erev that they're combining with a 6th group or with another house or another achatzer, if that's going to stay by them, so the Erev's coming to them, so then there's no issue of shlichus. They're joining with them, then there's no problem. You can just have one Erev according to everybody. You don't have to have anybody giving a new Erev. Those people are coming to join this existing Erev, not a problem. So again, the Machlokes Beis Hillel Beis Shammai is, if you have a group that's already joined in an Erev, or like in our case, joined by virtue of the fact that they live in one building, and then they're going to take an Erev somewhere else, this Erev they want to join with another Chatzar or another house somewhere else, they want to go bring it, can one of the 5 be a shliach and do it for everybody, or do they each have to send their own? Beis Shammai says they each have to send their own, and Beis Hillel says no, it's enough for them to just bring one. In the case where it's coming to them, there's never a problem. Everybody holds it's okay. This is the first girsa, and the Gemara brings another brisa which says clearly that whether the Erev is being brought to them or they're bringing it somewhere else, you only have to send one, and that is clearly Beis Hillel's opinion. Fits with Beis Hillel, no problem. Now, going to the second girsa in the brisa, the machlokes is in the case where the Erev is coming to them, and there Beis Hillel says that it's enough to have just one, and Beis Shammai says each one has to give a separate piece of bread for the Erev. If, however, the Erev is being brought to somebody else, then it's not enough. It's not enough, and you have to have each group send its own Erev, and that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai both agree with. Now, the third brisa, the brisa says that it's always enough for one to represent everybody. That will never fit with either of these opinions, because that one says that even if you're bringing the Erev somewhere else, it's enough to send just one who can represent everybody. And Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both clearly disagree with that, according to this version of the brisa, and therefore that Tana doesn't fit, not with Beis Shammai, not Beis Hillel, at least according to this version of the brisa, explaining the machlokes. Okay, we now begin the next Mishnah, which discusses the following case. You have a group of brothers and their father who all have separate houses in one chutzner, but they all eat from their father's house. That is their food source, but they sleep in separate houses. So the question is, are they considered to be one rishus, or are they considered to be multiple rishuyos? They all eat from the father's house, but they all sleep in separate houses. So Gemara, the Mishnah says as follows: if they're the only residents in the chutzner, so then they are considered to be already an Erev. They do not have to make an Erev between them. If there are other residents in the chutzner, and the Erev is being made by one of them, they're considered to be already joined in an Erev. Nobody has to make an Erev. Those other people have to make an Erev in one of their houses. They don't have to join. If, however, there's going to be an Erev in somebody else's house, then they each have to go place an Erev there. It's not enough that they are eating together in one house. They have to actually go join an Erev, and each one has to individually and separately make an Erev in the place where the Erev is actually going to be. Okay, now says the Gemara, this seems to indicate that your place of living is defined by where you sleep, because we see that they each sleep in a separate house, and that we're considering them to be separate houses, at least as far as that they have to go and make an Erev somewhere else. So the Gemara says, no, it's not the case. The case is where they sleep in separate houses, but they also eat in their own house. They come to the father's house, they pick up a pre-packed meal, they take it home, and they eat it home. So the place where they eat and sleep is both in their own homes. The only reason why they're considered to be joined is because their food support comes from their father to some extent. Okay, now the Gemara brings a brisa which discusses what type of dwelling is considered to be sufficient enough to be to consider the resident who lives there as a resident in the chasser who has to join the Erev Chaseris in order for everybody else to be able to carry there. So it says as follows: somebody lives in the gatehouse, which is a little hut next to the gate, or he lives in an achsadra, which is a structure which has walls and no roof, or it has a roof but no walls, or he lives on a porch, but that's all he owns. He doesn't own the chatzar, he doesn't own the house. He just has that. So that is not considered a house, not considered a significant enough place in which he lives, and he doesn't have to join the Erev Chatzeres. He's not considered a resident. If, however, he lives in the granary, or he lives in the barn, or he lives in the woodshed, so that is considered a house, and there he is a resident, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees slightly. He says, no, he's got to live in a real house. If he lives in a barn or a woodshed, that's not considered a house. He has to live in a real makom dira, what's called a makom dira. He has to live in a place that's a fitting house. And he says that there's a similar, you could see this from an incident that happened with Ben Nafacha, who had 5 residences in Usha, and he used some of them for storage and some of them for wood and some of them for cows, but he only lived in one of them, and said that, and the Chachamim were brought to give a psak on this case, and they said that the only place that he has to join the Erev for is the one that is a base dira, the one in which he actually lives. So Gemara says, what do you mean? The one in which he actually lives? Nobody says he has to actually live there. And even if he actually lives there, that doesn't help. It doesn't go by where you actually live. It goes by whether the house is a fitting house or not. So the Gemara says, yes, so change the gears slightly. What their psak actually was that the house that's fitting to live in, not a barn, and not a woodshed, and not a granary, a straw house, all these things don't count. It's only an actual fitting house. That is where you have to join the...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.